In this lecture, we'll be looking at the Augustan building program. We'll start by looking at Augustus's efforts to rebuild and beautify Rome after the decades of wars that left the city in a state of disrepair, and then talk a little bit about his use of public buildings to glorify his own name, his family, and to play the part of the personal patron of Rome. So Augustus famously said, "I found a city of brick and left a city of marble." And there was a lot of truth to this statement. He almost single-handedly undertook a restoration on massive scale, both restoration of buildings that had fallen into ruin during the period of civil wars, and also undertook the construction of new buildings. Among the types of buildings that he restored, perhaps the greatest category, the largest category, was temples, but also public buildings. He restored the hut of Romulus and Remus, very famously, partly as a way of highlighting his ancestry, of highlighting his connection to these first founders of the city of Rome. He also finished projects that had been planned by Julius Caesar but not completed. So in a lot of ways, it was Julius Caesar who first had the idea of spending large amounts of public money to beautify Rome. He had spent a significant amount of time in Alexandria, which was a gorgeous city. It was architecturally a wonder, glistening with marble, gold. And Caesar comes back to Rome and kind of feels like Rome is a second-class city, that its decoration is not worthy of the city itself, and so undertakes or plans a pretty extensive rebuilding program. But he's assassinated before he can do anything, and so part of what Augustus is doing is in fact carrying out the plans of Caesar, which has the double benefit of beautifying Rome, but also highlighting his pietas, his devotion to his father. Included among these projects was the rebuilding of the Senate House that had been burned down when Clodius was killed. Among the new construction that Augustus undertook, most famously, the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill. He also undertook less glorious projects, including aqueducts and sewers. And these were really necessary given the explosion in the population of the city of Rome over the last century. And it had really been a century since these kinds of basic public works had been expanded, had been managed in any kind of way in order to supply the citizens, and so they were vastly outdated. So on the left-hand side here is a statue of Mars, and we'll talk in a second about Augustus's temple to Mars Ultor. This statue dates a little bit later than that, but will give you some sense of what a cult statue to the god Mars would have looked like. So one of the first things that Augustus undertook back when he was Octavian, in the lead-up to the battle at Philippi, where he deals with Caesar's assassins, was the construction of a temple to the deified Julius, to his adopted father. And so begins now, even though he doesn't want to be worshipped as a god, begins to make sure that his father is. And of course, he would benefit then from being the son of a god. So there's it's a win-win situation. Then this is all that remains of that temple in the Roman Forum, but was a sign, again, of Augustus's religio and his pietas, and the fact that he's now combining civic religion and personal cult. These are the remains of perhaps the most famous temple in the Forum. It's the only temple in the Forum of Augustus, one of the most famous temples in the area of the Roman Forum. But these are the remains of the temple to Mars Ultor. And this is the temple that Augustus promised when he defeated the assassins of Caesar. So it's Mars the Avenger. And, Mars is the god of war, and Ultor there, the final adjective describing Mars as the avenging Mars. So it's not just warlike Mars. And you see there that this is a typical Greco-Roman temple elevated on a platform, and you can see some of the columns that still survive from this temple. But this would have been the highlight of Augustus's own forum, the Forum of Augustus. And this is a reconstruction of what that forum would have looked like. So can see the full reconstruction of the Temple of Mars Ultor that dominates in the top left-hand side of the slide. But this forum would have originally been constructed partly for the temple and to accommodate the temple, but also to provide space for law courts. And that was something that Augustus was very proud of. It was part of his propaganda about restoring law to Rome. So he provides in these walkways, there were rooms where trials could happen. One of the other major projects that Augustus undertakes in 28 is the Mausoleum of Augustus. And it survives, at least in its shell, fairly intact. It would have been heaped over in what was called the Etruscan style. So it's from Etruria, the style of tumulus graves. But again, hearkening back to this Italic practice and sort of setting Augustus in that tradition of the Etruscan ruler. But it would have been heaped over with earth, and then there were cypress trees planted on top. This was a family tomb. So one of the things, it wasn't just for Augustus, it wasn't just Augustus planning his own burial site, but it was planning for a family dynasty. And it was signaling to the Roman people as early as 28 that was the plan. That he wasn't going to be the last ruler. That he was planning to stabilize Rome and set down the groundwork for a family dynasty. So here are some review questions. You can press pause, go over these at your own pace. When you're done with these, you can resume the lecture. So one of the major roles that the senatorial aristocracy played in any city was that of patron. And urban patronage was incredibly important in the Republic. It had a very long tradition among the senatorial elite where these people with money would dedicate buildings, temples, public buildings, for the use of the community. And it was a way of accruing fame for themselves, for their family, while also doing a communal good. And cities depended on this kind of patronage by the elite in not a different way than modern cities do. When you think of all of the different buildings on the UT campus or our sports complexes that bear the names of famous donors, of big donors. It wasn't really any different in ancient Rome. And in these buildings would have dedicatory plaques that identified the donor who provided the money for their construction. People would build new buildings. They would spend the money for a new construction, particularly generals who vowed temples on the battlefield. But also buildings would be reconstructed or renovated. So buildings that were old would be renovated, modernized. So there were various forms that this patronage could take, but the key thing was there was great dependence on the senatorial aristocracy to do this. And it was a way for the aristocracy to essentially assert its value to the community. Augustus comes along and suddenly the mode of urban patronage changes. He doesn't allow the senatorial aristocracy to participate any longer. He strictly protects the right for himself and for his close family members. He does allow a few other people to dedicate buildings, to provide money for renovations, but it's a strictly guarded privilege. And most of it he does himself. And this is one of the ways that we see a real shift from Republican culture to the Principate, where we really do have now a princeps who is positioning himself as the patron of Rome. It's no longer a shared privilege. This is the image here. This is actually the Pantheon. You can see that Agrippa, Augustus's right-hand man, was allowed the opportunity to first construct this. So not a family member, but somebody very, very close to Augustus. The Theater of Marcellus is another example. So this was built to rival the Theater of Pompey, very much in that mode of appealing to the masses. And it was dedicated or allowed to be dedicated by Augustus's son-in-law, Marcellus. And so, again, a family member. It's not Augustus himself, but somebody very close to him that is permitted to dedicate this building that would have been welcomed happily, joyfully by the Roman people. Aqueducts were another important building construction under Augustus. He puts Agrippa in charge of this. Agrippa is made aedile. It was the aediles who oversaw public works. So Agrippa, who had been consul, kind of takes a few steps down the cursus honorum, becomes aedile, strictly in order to repair existing aqueducts and to build new ones. It was incredibly important to do this. The water supply to Rome had become entirely inadequate to supply the population. Augustus realized that he couldn't just provide circuses. He also needed to make sure people had drinking water. So he puts Agrippa in charge of this project, and Agrippa, in fact, remains informally as the caretaker of the aqueducts for his lifetime. And this will become an office in the empire as a recognition of the incredible importance of making sure that Rome has a good water supply, in the same way that somebody needs to be in charge of looking out for the grain supply. So there were 4 existing aqueducts that supplied the city, and they're listed here. You don't need to know these names, but just for your curiosity. But there were 4 at the time that Agrippa took on this project, but they were in disrepair and just did not supply a population that may have been as large as 1 million people. Agrippa then constructs 3 new aqueducts. So then, under Augustus, Rome has a total of 7 aqueducts supplying the city. It's a lot of aqueducts. And you can see the new ones that he supplies. Again, you don't need to know these names. And what you have in this picture is an example. This was actually the base of the aqueduct. So it's all that has survived. For the most part, aqueducts that were built above ground don't survive for us, in Rome at least. Here's an example of one that does survive, but outside of Rome in the provinces. And you can also see them in pretty large numbers in North Africa and Tunisia. But you can see the construction was built on a series of arches, and then the water would flow on the top arch. And of course it had to flow downhill. And so one of the things about these aqueducts is they're great feats of Roman engineering to get just the right grade so that the water flowed at the right pace. And they had various ways of controlling that pace, but making sure that it flowed clearly, and provided a steady supply. And you can imagine the manpower it took to build these aqueducts from water sources, and build them not just to supply Rome, but any city with any kind of large population, which by the age of Augustus was a large number of cities in Italy and also in the provinces. So here are some more review questions. I'll let you go over these at your own pace. When you're done with these, you're done with the lecture.